Now, protests over the strict COVID-19 restrictions have spilled into a third night spread across biggest cities in China, with many growing weary of snap lockdowns, lengthy quarantines, mass testing campaigns here. Scores of demonstrators gathered in the capital Beijing and financial hub Shanghai, holding blank pieces of paper to express their discontent. Some even called for Chinese President Xi Jinping to step down. The demonstrators also clashed with the police in Shanghai. Videos on your screens right now show police seizing and carrying a male demonstrator who was holding up a blank whiteboard. Some demonstrators even sang the Chinese national anthem and shouted, "Release the people." Now, this wave of civil disobedience unprecedented in mainland China since Chinese President Xi Jinping assumed power a decade ago. The people in the country are frustrated over Xi's signature zero-COVID policy, which still continues to grip China nearly 3 years into the pandemic. The demonstrators also took to the streets in the cities of Wuhan, where small gatherings held peaceful vigils. Students demonstrated in various university campuses across China as well.
疫情其实挺沉重的，但是没想到能有这么多的人来，这个其实是对我有一个特别大的改观，因为我一直认为在中国现有的一个社会环境里是，不会有环境能组织这样的活动的，因为大家知道，在过去的几年，我们的言论自由还有我们的这些各方面表达自己想法的这些途径都在被逐渐的封锁。没想到有一天我们还能走到街头上去，公开的表达我们的诉求。
Now, the recent protests have sprung up across Shanghai and Beijing in wake of the deadly fire in Urumqi, the capital of the western region of Xinjiang. Several demonstrators massed outside the government offices, chanted slogans like "Lift lockdowns." They are blaming the lengthy COVID lockdowns for hampering the rescue efforts. Despite the zero-COVID policy failing to meet its target, China plans to keep it in place regardless of the public pushback and its mounting economic toll. Officials in China have defended the policy as life-saving and necessary to prevent overwhelming the healthcare system. Now, for more on this, our correspondent Patrick Falk is now joining us from Hong Kong. Thank you so much for joining us, Patrick. What can you tell us about the situation currently? There have been multiple demonstrations, as I mentioned, and unprecedented, of course.
Yeah, that's right. Multiple demonstrations, including here in Hong Kong at the University of Hong Kong on the campus. There was a small demonstration that took place yesterday, but you know, these protests are gathering momentum. It is taking place in various cities across the mainland, including Chengdu, Wuhan, on university campuses in Beijing. Many people also defying health officials' advice to stay indoors because of the spread of the virus in Beijing's Chaoyang district, and of course also in Shanghai, where protests have arguably been more confrontational on Urumqi Road. All this triggered by the apartment fire that took place in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang province. But these protests aren't just about COVID curbs and what happened in Urumqi. People are also voicing discontent over censorship, with a lot of people symbolically holding up blank pieces of paper. They're also challenging the leadership directly, many calling for the Communist Party and the president himself to step down. They're doing so at great personal risk. But part of the reason why this is happening also is because, in a sense, they feel they have strength in numbers. Under President Xi Jinping, there's been very little room for dissent, and there have been very heavy crackdowns in the past over any sort of demonstration. But you know, part of this is happening, as I say, because there are so many people getting increasingly frustrated and angry over COVID curbs, and they have reached a boiling point.
Right, absolutely. Patrick, thank you so much. You raised a very important point there. So the protests, as you mentioned, it's gaining momentum here. And as the world tries to live with the virus, China has been adamant on its zero-COVID strategy. Do you feel these unprecedented demonstrations could bring about some ease in restrictions?
Well, they arguably have already. In Urumqi, officials there have already agreed to start unwinding some of the restrictions. Remember, parts of Urumqi, some people in Urumqi have been locked down for over 100 days. In Beijing also, we're hearing that people complaining about restrictions and the enforcement of COVID curbs are actually having the effects of getting local communities in particular to ease up on some of the restrictions and to not lock them inside their buildings because of the uncertainty and the disruption that all of that is causing. But at the same time, state media is also saying that China must unswervingly stick to the zero COVID approach. President Xi Jinping, as we know, has personally endorsed this policy. So it's difficult to say in the long run whether or not there's going to be any change in strategy or a change in approach to the zero COVID policy. As we know, officials have been trying to refine and adjust the zero COVID strategy, but it's having very little effect. Case numbers are at a record high, daily numbers that is, and the biggest problem essentially is that there is no roadmap on how exactly China is going to move away from this.
Right. Right, Patrick. Also coming back to a point that you'd made earlier, people have been demonstrating, calling for the removal of President Xi as well. So how do you see the situation unfolding on that front?
Well, certainly there have been some eye-opening and vocal protests and challenges directly to President Xi Jinping. In some cases, we've been hearing reports of people chanting, "We don't want lifelong leaders, we don't want emperors." But as I say, this is something that could cause them a lot of trouble. There has, as I say, been very little room for dissent under President Xi Jinping and very little room for anybody to challenge the Chinese leadership. So there is every possibility that the government could crack down heavily on this protest movement. They certainly don't want to be seen to relenting to protesters out on the streets. And part of how this evolves in the coming days is whether or not there is continued momentum. But already we're seeing security being stepped up in various places, roadblocks being set up in Shanghai, people getting arrested there as well. Notably also, authorities have been warning reporters, foreign journalists in particular, not to go to these protests as far as we understand. They do not want images of this unrest getting out and possibly for it to inspire other people to take to the streets to protest against zero COVID curbs.
All right. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for bringing us the latest on this. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.